Okay. Talk about a little issue with the Fuji, and yes, let me clip the microphone on first. It's not an issue with Fuji. There have been many people say that the owner manual for the Fuji X-T10 and the X-T1 well, they suck, and of course they do. But I also do have the owner's manual for the Fuji X-T1, X-T10, but excuse me, the book written by a guy in Europe I won't mention on the Fuji X-T1 and X-T10. And we're talking about IS mode. Obviously, of course, this lens doesn't have optical image stabilization, the 27mm, but this one does, 18 to 135, as well as most other Fujis. IS mode, which is menu number 5 on your Fuji menu. You can actually dial it in and you go turn it on, turn your Fuji on, go into menu, and it is in shooting menu, subset number 5, and it's IS mode. And there's stage 1, or mode 1, and mode 2. Mode 1 is the default setting, and Fuji put that there as the default setting for a reason. If you actually look in the Fuji owner's manual, and there's been much discussion about this, they say, well, the Fuji owner's manual doesn't really tell you a damn thing. I mean, it gives you a super small blurb about the mode 1 and mode 2, but it doesn't tell you, because Fuji is different in image stabilization. We're not talking about lens side here, where you have the image stabilization on. We're talking about camera side here. You know, one is obviously sucking more power, which is the default mode of optical image stabilization, mode 1, which is the default, which means it's always stabilizing the image. You know, namely when you're looking through the viewfinder. And of course, if you got, you know, your 200 millimeters, which is equivalent here, 135, you know, it's great that you don't have that much shake while you're actually composing before you actually depress the shutter the rest of the way and take the picture. Now, it is the case that image stabilization can introduce shake, because if it engages like it does in mode 2, when you once you fully depress the shutter, then you've got an issue where the camera, the image stabilization is jumping as the image is being taken. And that's an issue, especially at slower shutter speeds of like 1/60 of a second and lower, 1/30th, 1/15. But actually, after much exhaustive testing with 2 different Fuji X-T1 bodies and 4 different lenses, I found out that this information in the book, not the book from Fuji, the user's manual, but this book on the Fuji, is wrong. It's not entirely wrong. It is just, let's say, half inaccurate. And I found that even like on the 18 to 55, at like anything at like 1/100th of a second and lower, that having it in Fuji's default mode, where it's constantly on, image stabilization is constantly on, which obviously does draw more power. You need to have a pocket full of batteries anyway, that the images, you know, and I am not able to hold the camera really steady, that the images do come out better, much sharper. And because it's the image stabilization is not jerking at the very last, it is constantly on, and once you actually depress the shutter and finally depress the shutter the rest of the way to take the shot, the image stabilization is on throughout the entire thing. So where would I have it off? I would have it off at the shutter speeds of higher than 1/100th of a second, and at the focals of like 40 and less. But I do notice, after much exhaustive testing, that contrary to this person stating that he basically only shoots in IS mode, i.e. image stabilization mode 2, most of the time. I cannot agree with that. Obviously mode 1 sucks more battery, but Fuji does have this camera set to image stabilization default mode 1 for a good reason, and I found that even at 1/60th of he states at 1/30th of a second, but I found that not to be the case. Perfectly, very, very helpful at 1/100th of a second and 1/60th of a second, even at focal lengths of 55 millimeters on multiple lenses. And I am able to hold a camera really damn steady, but it still helped. So That is different. We're not talking about the switch here on the lens. We're talking about mode 1, mode 2, IS mode on the camera and your shooting menu on the Fuji. So that is a peculiarity that is absolutely not defined in the user manual for the Fuji X-T1 and X-T10, because the manuals, you know, God bless Fuji, the manuals really suck. They're not informative. It's like they tell you something, it's like, well, that's great, but why don't you explain it? Not good. So actually having these books are actually helpful. I'm not scolding the person that wrote this book on the Fuji X-T1, but he's really only half right. And because when I read this, you know, I kind of took that as a gospel, but he's not really right. He is half right, but he's still not right. He actually says he only uses it at like 1/60 of a second or less at longer focals, and I found that to be hooey. I found it to be the case useful at even 1/100th of a second to have it in continuous IS mode number 1 at you know, 1/100th of a second, and even at 55 millimeters. So take that into consideration, because Fuji doesn't explain that, and this book on the X-T1 is half inaccurate, and that is a question that I've found that a lot of people kept asking about IS mode number 1 and mode number 2. I said the only reason I would take it off of mode number 1 is if you got a fast shutter speed, or you really, you know, they boil things down very simply. The only reason I would take it out of mode 1, which is the default, is if you got a fast shutter speed, or you're shooting at you know, a 35 millimeter or less, like the 35 millimeter f2 Fuji, or the 27, or the 10-24. So that's that. Okay, I was glad I was able to clarify that up, and I hope that helps somebody. Thanks for watching. Bye.